I'm Naomi Firestone Teeter, JBC's Executive Director, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's discussion with Rachel Beanland, whose book Florence Adler Swims Forever is the focus of today's conversation, which just came out yesterday from Simon & Schuster. As always, we're so appreciative of you joining us here each week to celebrate authors of recently released books. While we'll be taking a slight pause in our schedule after today's program, we hope you will watch the videos of our previous author talks. Link is in the chat. And stay tuned for an updated schedule in the coming weeks. Our mission at Jewish Book Council is to educate and enrich the community through Jewish literature. Visit jewishbookcouncil.org to learn about JBC's reviews, essays, and literary journal, Paper Brigade, our book club resources and author tours, and our literary awards, including the National Jewish Book Awards. I hope you will check out all of our programs and resources, and that you might also consider becoming a member to support JBC's continued initiatives. This is our 11th installment of our Lunchtime series, and we hope you'll support today's author by purchasing a copy of her book, Florence Adler Swims Forever, using the link in our chat. On the screen, you can currently see the JBC team, and we'll all be chiming in with questions throughout the conversation. If any of you in the audience would like to share your own questions during the talk, you're more than welcome. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Also, on the top right of your screen, you have the option to view the discussion in gallery or speaker mode. So please choose whichever one you prefer. This week, I'm pleased to reintroduce you to Michelle Zarov, our program associate, who will be leading the discussion today, along with my colleagues from the Jewish Book Council. Over to you, Michelle.
Thank you so much, Naomi. Welcome everyone to our Authors at the Table event. I am very excited to properly introduce Rachel Beanland. Rachel Beanland is an MFA candidate in creative writing at Virginia Commonwealth University. She holds a bachelor's degree in art history and journalism from the University of South Carolina and lives in Richmond, Virginia with her husband and 3 children. Welcome, Rachel. It's such a treat to have you with us here today.
Thank you. It's really great to be here.
How are you and where are you joining us from today? How have you been spending your days during COVID time?
Well, yesterday was a little different because it was actually the day of the book launch. So I actually did get out of my house. I delivered, for people who had ordered from our local bookstore, I volunteered to be a delivery driver for them. They've been so sweet and have been delivering books during COVID. And so I said, well, I'll help you out and I'll deliver some books. And so I actually got to, throw on a mask and drive around town and kind of put books in people's hands, which was really fun.
That's so fun.
And then we had a very socially distanced book signing out on the sidewalk in front of the bookstore. So yesterday was a little abnormal, but most of the time I'm in my office in Richmond. I live in the Fan District, which is kind of the older historic part of Richmond. You may have seen it on the news recently because we've been slowly saying goodbye to each one of our Confederate statues on Monument Avenue. So it's been kind of an exciting time to live here, and that's where I am.
That sounds amazing. That experience sounds really special. So do you think you can share with our viewers a little bit about your book and just give a brief introduction and just tell us what it's about?
Yeah, so my book is based on a true story that occurred in my family about 90 years ago. When my grandmother was a little girl, she was on the beach in Atlantic City. She had been raised in Atlantic City, and she was there with her family, and her 20-year-old aunt, Florence, went out for a training swim. Florence was training to swim the English Channel. She was a champion swimmer, and she went out for a swim and she drowned. And so one of my grandmother's earliest memories was watching her aunt's body be brought back up onto the beach. And that summer, my grandmother happened to be living with her grandparents because her mother was in the hospital on bed rest. She had lost a baby the summer before, and the family, the doctors and family members were concerned she would lose, another baby. And so she was on hospital bed rest. And so when her sister drowned, the family made the decision not to tell her that her sister had just died, and the whole family kind of went in on the secret. It was a story that I had always heard growing up. I mean, I had heard about Florence's death, but the the focus of the story, when my mother would tell it, and occasionally I would hear bits and pieces from my grandmother, the story was always focused on the secret, on the fact that, you know, my grandmother's grandmother could have been so strong as to kind of like go into that hospital room and act like everything was fine. And really she was in the middle of, you know, just absolute, you know, grief. And so when I was thinking about writing my first novel, that story was very much on my mind. I mean, it's always been on my mind. I, as a kid, would always, you know, hear the story. My mother would tell it to me. And I just wondered, you know, well, what if in my book, she's named Fanny, what if she had wanted to know that her sister died? You know, like who was it? How were all of these, how did they know that this was the right thing to do, you know? And so when I started thinking about writing a novel, it just seemed like a natural story for me to dig deeper on. And so I created a cast of characters. It's set in Atlantic City in 1934. It takes place over the course of a summer. So it's not giving away too much of a spoiler to say that Florence dies very early on in the book. And really the book is about everything that happens to the family in the months following her death.
Wow, it's an amazing story. So do you think you can read a little bit from your book to give our viewers a little taste?
Yeah, so I started the book from the perspective of Gussie. The book is told in 7 rotating perspectives. And one of those perspectives is a child, a 7-year-old little girl named Gussie, who is, of course, closely modeled on my grandmother. And so I'll just read a couple of paragraphs. I know we don't have much time. Okay. Gussie Feldman didn't enjoy swimming, but she did like to lie on the wet sand in the shadow of Atlantic City's steel pier and wait for the tiniest ripple of a wave to wash over her. If she positioned herself just so, her body rose with the incoming tide, and for a brief moment, she felt weightless. She was lying in just such a manner, staring up at the bright blue sky, when her Aunt Florence's face came into her field of vision. I discovered a lovely note when I arrived home, Florence said. I wanted to give my compliments to the artist. Gussie grinned. She had devoted more than a quarter of an hour to writing the note, which she'd carefully positioned on the oriental rug in the entryway of her grandparents' apartment, where Florence would be sure to see it. With her colored pencils, she had written in big purple letters, Dear Florence and Anna, we are at the beach. Come have fun. Love, Gussie. At the last minute, she decided she had not used enough exclamation marks, so she added 3 more after Florence's name, but stopped short of allocating any to Anna. Maybe if her grandparents' house guest noticed she had not been awarded any, she'd decide to stay at the apartment. Do you want to be a mermaid? Gussie asked Florence now, hoping to capitalize on her aunt's good mood. Sometimes, if Gussie asked sweetly, Florence would cross her legs at the ankles and pretend the 2 of them were mer people, out for a swim around the Tongan Islands, which Gussie had read about in her picture book, Fairy Tales of the South Seas. For a few minutes, then I'm going to go out for a swim. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for that. So given how much of the story is based on your actual family, what was the writing process like for you?
Well, I definitely I did a lot of research. My family has not lived in Atlantic City for many, many years. I mean, I never spent any time there as a kid. For those of you who are from the Atlantic City area or went there, you know, as, you know, at some point on vacation, you know, my understanding is it's changed a lot, you know, in the intervening years. And so I needed to do kind of a deep dive to figure out what Atlantic City was like in the 30s. And my grandparents were still alive when I started working on the book. And so they were able to tell me some, you know, pieces of information. As far as, you know, I also did research on actually Florence, the real Florence was Florence Lowenthal. I did research on her death. In Atlantic City, I was able to find in the archives like a copy of the newspaper article from when she had died. I found even like the old lifeguarding logs from, you know, that charted her drowning. So there was some additional information I was able to glean. But then at a certain point I had to say, okay, I know what I know. And what I know was never going to be enough to like write a nonfiction book, or, you know, it was a very like small amount of information. And then I just gave myself permission to write a good book and, you know, and make it the best novel it could be. And so there are characters in this book that, you know, are completely fictitious. There are certainly circumstances that are completely fictitious. And I think that for me, I was able to do that because you know, this is a family. I mean, it's based on my family, but it was 90 years ago. So I didn't know any of the people who are, you know, with the exception of my grandmother, who was a little girl. I didn't know any of the people that I wrote about. So I think that maybe made it a little bit easier. My mother is a big fan, but she of course did know some of these people. And I think for her, it was a little more of a challenge to say like, okay, it's fiction. Like Isaac is not my grandfather. You know, that was a little bit, maybe more of a challenge for people who were closer to the characters.
Right. So it sounds like you got that perfect blend of like fiction and fact, which is awesome. So what I loved about your book, and as you mentioned before, you had these rotating perspectives throughout the book. And I feel like each family member gets their own voice, and it just allows us to see multiple perspectives of a shared experience, which is really cool. Why did you decide to write your book in this way?
You know, the characters came to me very early on, almost fully formed. Like I knew that Florence's mother would play a huge role in the book, because of course she's like the lead secret keeper. You know, she's the one that spurs the whole thing. I knew there always had to be someone in the hospital bed. You know, that was Fanny. I couldn't resist putting a child in the book, you know, that kind of would have mirrored my grandmother. And then, you know, I was really interested in giving every character that I wrote some sort of secret that they were also working to keep, usually for someone else's benefit. Because that was what I was so interested in, was this idea that we had always placed this would be my great-great-grandmother on a pedestal for keeping this secret. That it was, you know, defined within my family as the absolute right thing to do. Like, of course you would keep the secret. Of course you would do whatever you needed to do to protect your child in the hospital. And so for me, I think when I was building out the characters, I wanted to determine ways, like use the big secret as kind of the overarching umbrella, but then come up with smaller ways that each of these characters were also exploring this idea. And so the rotating perspectives really worked well for it. They were tricky to write. Like, it was very tricky to keep it all straight and make sure that my storylines kind of like continued to follow through each character. And, you know, even if a character didn't show up for a couple of chapters, then I needed to make sure that their storyline was kind of weaved through other people's chapters. So it was definitely a challenge to write, but it was a really fun challenge. And I like that technique. And I think for a reader, I like reading it because, you know, when I read books that are written in rotating perspectives, it's like you almost don't get bored, or you can't get, you know, you get to move to someone else's head. So I think it's partly that it's just the kind of book I like to read.
Right. And I think also this circumstance is so like, what is everyone thinking? Like, I want to know what is everyone going through? And you did that really well.
And you need to, like, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but you need to be able to jump heads in order to not give all the secrets away too soon. So it's like, sometimes, you know, if I had just stayed with Isaac or stayed with Esther, it's like you just would have known too much too fast. And so it was nice to be able to leave people right when I wanted to, you know, move away from some reveal.
Yeah. So you did mention that one of the characters is a 7-year-old girl. How was writing from her perspective different than writing from, you know, that of the adult characters?
So, you know, I think writers frequently talk about the fact that writing children is just really hard. You know, that it's tough because, I mean, partially we forget what it's like to be a kid, or we don't get it quite right. Or I think also writers have a lot of trepidation that readers don't want to read kids, you know, that it's not as fun to read someone who is not fully formed up here. And I have a little bit of a different view on that. I mean, I think that I wouldn't want like a whole book with children narrators, but I think one is able to offer a really unique perspective, because for me, what Gussie did was she allowed us to kind of see the situation almost more clearly because she doesn't have a filter. And so she's overhearing all of these conversations and she's kind of peripherally in on the secret, but she doesn't quite understand it. And the way she interprets it is sometimes off, but then it's sometimes dead on. And she's able to say things that other people can't say. So I find it to be extremely rewarding to kind of drop a child into the mix. I happened to have a little girl who was about her age when I was starting to write the book. My daughter Clementine's 12 now. But so that was also helpful to, you know, I had a precocious little kid down the hall that I could use to mirror it.
That's great. That's such nice inspiration. So now I'm going to open up to questions from other staff members and the audience.
Great.
Rachel, sort of going off of what you last were talking about, I thought you did such an amazing job of depicting your characters' mindsets in this way that feels just very accurate to the time period. Kind of going from everything from their attitudes to like interfaith marriage or sexuality to the fact that they're on the verge of World War II, but the threat of the Holocaust doesn't really feel as real to all of them. Like I was especially struck by Isaac and how to him, he feels like the restrictions for Jews in Germany aren't nearly so bad to what his family went through with pogroms in Russia and stuff. So I was wondering like how you went about capturing these characters' mindsets and whether it was ever like challenging for you as a writer not to let our current hindsight sort of cloud your portrayals of what it was like for these characters in the past.
Yeah, I did a lot of research on immigration during that time period. And, you know, I think many of us are surprised when we learn, you know, at some point just how hard it was for Jews to get out of Europe, not necessarily because, you know, Germany was keeping them from leaving in the 30s, but that the US was not, you know, allowing more of them into the country, and we're creating all kinds of, you know, hurdles for them in order to leave. So, you know, for me, there were kind of natural tie-ins between much of what we're talking about with immigration today and, you know, what was happening then. And it was certainly something I was interested in. But I always tried to be very true to the exact date that they were in. You know, they were in 34. The book is set in the summer of 1934. There are certain things they just don't know. You know, they cannot know these things. And I didn't want my reader to ever feel like they were being beaten over the head with like, oh, the Holocaust is coming. It's coming, you know. But I do think it informs, I mean, you know, readers are going to read a book set in 1934 knowing what's coming. And so that does introduce like a natural sense of tension to the book. And I think that I was able to kind of work with that, particularly for Anna's storyline. You know, I really tried, when I would talk to my grandmother and even my mother to a degree about Florence's drowning and just that time period. And you know, one of the stories that my grandmother told me at some point was that, that basically after Florence died, they destroyed all of her photos. And that was something that has really stayed with me. Like that's just from a different era. Like, you know, you just can't imagine doing that now, you know, losing a child and then destroying all of her photographs. And so I did try to always keep in my head what mourning and grief looked like in that era. And like my, you know, when Florence died, her family, they like never mentioned her name again. It was just too painful, you know, and that's very different than the way we memorialize our dead today. And so when I was in doubt, when I was writing the book, if I thought like, ooh, would Esther say that? I always veered towards, no, she would not, you know, because my grandmother was just like, you know, when she would tell stories from that era, it was like kids were seen and not heard. You know, you wouldn't have ever expressed your true feelings about this, that, or the other thing. So I did try to be true to that feeling. And the interfaith marriage was one thing where, you know, the relationship between Anna and Stuart, where I knew I was like pushing the boundaries, you know, on an interfaith marriage in the 30s. But for me, I envision, I'm interested in interfaith marriage. I'm in an interfaith marriage. My parents were in an interfaith marriage. So it's something I'm interested in, but also, you know, I wrote a situation where it called for it, you know, where there were multiple reasons why it would make sense, for her.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
When I was growing up in the 60s, my family spent many Passover vacations in Atlantic City, back in the day when kosher hotels lined the boardwalk rather than casinos.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of nostalgia reading your book. But cocooned in the hotel and a little girl, I had no idea there was a local Jewish community in Atlantic City like the one you described. Mm-hmm. How did you go about researching the details of the period there? Because plenty had not changed by...
Yeah, so, I mean, yeah, if you go to Atlantic City now, very little looks the same. So that's not very helpful. But I did a good amount of research. My grandparents were from Atlantic City, so I had lots of books and, you know, kind of tour guides and different things that they'd had over the years. One of the things I did was I printed out, in fact, it's right behind me on this desk, like a big map of Atlantic City from like 1929, like as close as I could get to the era of my book. And I put it on foam core and I put little pins in it all over the place where I would figure out, okay, this diner was on this corner, or, you know, this amusement was here. And that helped me as they were kind of walking through Atlantic City. And, you know, if Anna and Stuart left, you know, the hotel, I knew what they were going to pass on the way, that kind of thing. So that was helpful. You know, my grandmother had always told me when she talked about Atlantic City, she said Atlantic City was a Jewish town. And I had that in the back of my head. And when I started to look at census data, I mean, she really was right. Like if you look at Atlantic City as compared to other cities of its size at that time, there was a greater percentage of Jews there than other places. And I think, I mean, this is the research kind of backs this up, that partly it was because Atlantic City didn't exist until like the 1850s, 1860s, when they ran railroad out from Philadelphia to the island. And so it was a new frontier. And so when people arrived from Europe as immigrants, you know, you could go to New York or Philadelphia or Baltimore, or, you know, a place where you maybe had some family or connections. But if you really wanted to strike out on your own, Atlantic City in that era needed everything. Like it was rising out of the sand. And so, you know, you could be the first, you know, baker or the first pharmacist or the first lawyer, you know. So I think it just happened that Atlantic City came to be during an era when you've got, you know, a flood of Jewish immigrants coming to this country. And it was a great like landing pad for them. And I thought that was very interesting as I was researching the book.
So Rachel, when I read your book, not to give anything away, I was fascinated to find out about the incubators and the babies in Atlantic City. Yeah. I had another author tour last year or 2 years ago about the same thing on Coney Island too. And I never heard about it before. And it was just so fascinating to hear about what that was and what that did to help newbies. So can you talk a little bit about that whole?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating piece of American history. I mean, these incubators I think they were started, you know, they were kind of invented in Germany, the idea of an incubator. And so Kumi was able to, brought him over to the US and was interested in them and thought that maybe they, you know, were going to help babies. Right. But no hospitals were interested. I mean, they were a newfangled, you know, invention. What, put a baby in a box and it will live? Like, it was just too insane to be real. And so he completely organized these, you know, they were like boardwalk amusements, and they would take in babies and put them in the incubators. And sure enough, over a decade or two, these babies started to live, you know, and their success rates were much, much better than babies that were born in the hospital with nothing. And so you started to get hospitals saying, well, maybe we should check this out and buy some incubators. It's just a fascinating part of kind of American history. And there were a lot of things like that with researching the 30s. I mean, the Dion quintuplets, which I mentioned in the book, that was so interesting for me. And also, I mean, I had heard about them before, but it was perfect for, you know, I've got this woman in a hospital who's trying to have a baby. And here you've got this woman in Canada who's just delivered 5, which, I mean, every single day of that summer, there was news coverage on those babies, you know, and I would go back and read the New York Times and these different papers. And it was like, there would be these little articles that were like, the babies took 2 ounces of milk today. That was the news. You'd get a little more the next day, right? You know, people were infatuated with them. So there were a lot of things like that were fun. And you've got to be careful when you're writing to not overdo it and just sprinkle in this stuff like crazy, but a little bit can, I think, be really fun.
Rachel, I just have one more question for you. Your character mentions how similar the atmosphere in Atlantic City is to the atmosphere in F. Scott Fitzgerald's Tender is the Night. I thought that was so interesting, and I wondered what other books or literary traditions inspired you?
Let me think. That's a good question. I mean, I definitely was reading what was I mean, I read so many different things. I would read I would read the weirdest things to write the book. Like I'd like to say that I was just reading fine literature all the time, but I was reading like lifeguard manuals from, you know, the 30s, and I was reading memoirs from lifeguards in the 50s, and I was reading, I read a book, like a manual on how to set up a bakery, you know, like a processing plant for a bakery. So a lot of the stuff I was reading to actually write the book was not really that like exciting for other readers. And I wouldn't recommend you go read these things. But I think as far as like the kind of work that inspires me, I love a family drama. I mean, that's, you know, what this book is being described as. I mean, they say to write what you like to read. And I like, you know, big family dramas. I like ensemble casts, like even for movies. I like throwing a lot of people together and then kind of seeing how they react and how they bump into each other. So that was kind of inspiring for me. Some of the comps that we used when we were selling the book that I had loved was like Colin Tolbine's Brooklyn and Boston Girl by Anita Diamant. Kind of these quiet family dramas that are character driven, but yet are not without plot. I do like some plot. So I think maybe those would be some examples of ones that inspired me.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah. That's all the time we have today, unfortunately, but thank you so much for being here today, Rachel. And please be sure to check out a link to buy her book, Florence Adler Swims Forever, in our chat. We also did not get the chance to ask some of the questions from the audience, but we will make sure to send them all to Rachel. And we will be taking a short break from the series for the next few weeks. But we thank you all for joining us today and throughout the past 11 weeks. And we hope to see you back here soon and we resume the conversation. Thank you so much, Rachel. This was great.
Thank you.
Bye, Rachel. Thanks.
Thank you, Rachel.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Thank you.